Dynamic biblical discussions with special guests exploring tough biblical issues, academic scholarship, ethics, archaeology, textual criticism, Old Testament, New Testament, Bible interpretation, apocalyptic literature, Christian history, ancient Near East cultures. You're tuned in to Conversations with Pastor Cliff on Puluso Ministries.
Good day, everyone. My name is Cliff Sikowe, and welcome to Puluso Ministries. And today we are hosting a wonderful guest called, his name is Professor Christo van der Merwe, and he is coming from Stellenbosch University. And I would like to just give you a background of who he is and what he has done before we actually chose him to come and address us on this specific issue on how to actually evaluate Bible translations that we find in English. So Professor Christo van der Merwe was appointed as a lecturer at the University of the North, which is currently known as the University of Limpopo. In 1985, he obtained a DLit in Semitic languages in 1988 at Stellenbosch University and joined this university, meaning Stellenbosch University, in 1989 as a researcher. So currently he serves as a professor in the Department of Ancient Studies and director of Center for Bible Interpretation and Translation in Africa at Stellenbosch University. He is also the editor of the Journal of the Northwest Semitic Languages. He has been a research affiliate of the Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Cambridge since 2017. He has published 57 articles in accredited journals and 17 chapters in books, and he has supervised 21 master's degrees and 26 PhD degrees. And he was an editor of the Lexham Hebrew English Interlinear Bible, and he co-authored also the Biblical Hebrew Reference Grammar that came out in 1999. That was the first edition, and the second edition was published in 2017. So he also served as a Hebrew language expert of Afrikaans version of the Bible for the deaf in 1998 to 2005. From 2005 to 2020, which is last year, he was a member of the editorial committee of the new translation of the Bible into Afrikaans. So we can see that Professor Christo van der Merwe has done quite extensive work in what he has done in his journey. And the question is to all of us that are here today, you know, if there are so many Bibles in English, I mean, we find that there are over approximately 500 or even 600 at some point of the Bibles that are in English. And how does one begin to look at these, Professor Christo van der Merwe? And if you could perhaps help us to say, as a lay person or even as a pastor, how do I actually evaluate these Bibles that are sort of presented before me? Can you sort of help us with that? Welcome.
Yes, Cliff, thank you for that introduction. Also, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Well, in South Africa, this is 5 o'clock in the afternoon. As Cliff said, I spent about the last 25 years on as part of a team trying to prepare a new Bible in Afrikaans, but also in our university we have a module in the history of Bible translation. So I'm very much interested in the history of Bible translation, and that's why we are aware that there are so many translations, and we know that people and our pastors always say, oh, what shall I do? What is the best? Which one should I use? Now, this is a difficult question. And I think one must make 4 distinctions. The first one I would make is a historical one. If we talk about English translations, for example, the first English translation or big one that we all know about is the King James of 1611. This was not the first English translation. There were earlier translations, the Tyndale, the Geneva Bible, and there were the Matthew Bible. But the one that most of all know is the King James one. And the King James that was published in 1611 is still very popular. It's still one under the top 10 best-selling Bibles, if I understand correctly, in America. So it's important, if you look at the English translations, okay, when was it published? So we have the 1611 King James, we have the revised King James about 1880, and it's important to distinguish between those two Bibles. There are some difference between them. And then we have in America, especially the American Standard Version of 1901. And then the next big translation in the States was the RSV. That was about in the 1958, more 1952, first the English and later the whole one, the entire one. And since the 1950s, really, we had a huge number of translations and also revisions. Many of you, if I just can name a few of them, in England we have the New English Bible. Then we have the Good News Bible in America in the 60s, and then we have the NIV. We have the new RSV. We have the Jerusalem Bible. If I can name more, in recent times we have the Common English Bible. But the best I would say is important that you look at the date to see, because that's why one of the things that happened in the world of Bible translations, languages develop. That's why the King James was asked to be revised, because the English language developed. So the first term division is important to look at when was it made. Now, another important distinction is to make a distinction between Bible Society Bibles and private initiatives. Now, that is published by a private company. Now, I know that in America, it's not so important, but especially in other parts of the world, your Bible Society Bibles are often, they are made by the Bible Society on request of the churches. So it's not the Bible Society that decide people need a Bible. Churches approach them and say, we need a Bible or a new Bible. And then they ask the churches to appoint people for them, suggest translations that represent the churches. And of course, the churches also often, well, especially in South Africa, they contribute to the cost of the Bible Society. And those translations can take quite long, up to 15 years, because it goes through different processes. The translation team appointed by the churches or nominated by the churches and then later organized by the Bible Society, they prepare the translation. That translation must go out to the churches, and when they are happy, they send in critique. Then the teams must look at those Bibles again, at those suggestions, and in the end, eventually the Bible is then finished by the team appointed by the churches and presented to the churches. That's why I say it's a long process, and it's very important for them, for that team, to listen to what the churches ask they want. Time is not so, well, time is important, but for them, the quality of the translation is very important. In the case of private institutions, well, I think it's fair to say they want to make money. And often, especially, again, I can speak mainly for South Africa, you see that the time that to make such a translation is much shorter. And it doesn't have all those quality control processes that you have with Bible Society Bibles. So that's another way to say, okay, where is this Bible coming from? Now, I must at the same point say, I know that in the States it's somewhat different, because if you think of the New International, the NIV, although it's a private initiative, nowadays they are also a mission, and they really make certain they have regular revisions to make certain that of the quality of the translation. Now, a third distinction I think that is important to make is, what is the translation approach? Now, what does this mean?
Christo, before you get into the third initiative, I just want to pause you just to backtrack onto, if you can sort of supply an example of a Bible that was done privately and then one that was more like an initiative excuse me, from Bible Society.
Well, in terms of in South Africa, I can. Sorry, Cliff, I just want to make certain. Do you want me to talk about South African Bibles, or you talk about English Bibles?
I think English Bibles that were mainly as an example of something that can be more general. I mean, because we can encounter Bibles that are also in the States that are more like someone that was done by someone privately, or it was done by a Bible society of some sort. Yes.
I think a very good a good example in America is the Living Translation that started off when a pastor was trying to paraphrase his Bible. I think it was American Standard Version for his grandchild, and then he realized he didn't understand it, and he start then to paraphrase the whole Bible. Eventually, it was given out as the Living Bible, and they found it, the Tyndale publishers. And later on, eventually, in the beginning, the Living Bible was very popular. And then people start to realize, but oh, this is actually a translation of a translation, and it's very, the paraphrase, we cannot often, it's very interpretive. And the Tyndale then say, okay, let's do it again. And then they made the New Living Translation. The New Living Translation was also then published by this Tyndale. So that is, can say, a privately driven translation. Now, in America, in England, the New English Bible, the Revised New English Bible, those are, for example, Bibles that was published by a British Bible Society.
Okay. It makes sense. Then if you can touch back on the approaches as you were touching on it before I backtrack. Yes, please.
Yes. Now, I think it's easy to say there are only two approaches, but that is an oversimplification.
Yes.
So I would rather say that you have to see 2 points of a continuum. Some are very word for word, and other can be regarded as meaning-based translations. So what is a word for word translation? It means the idea is that you must try to stick as closely as possible to the wording of the Greek and the Hebrew and the Aramaic text. Now, of course, you cannot do that because very accurately, because the structure of languages differ. For example, Hebrew starts always with a verb, and English, the sentences do not start with a verb. Now, examples of your word for word translation, English translation will be the RSV, the King James, the New King James, the RSV, the New RSV. Those are all examples of, I would say, word for word translations. Word for word translations. Now, the so-called meaning-based translations are where people say, well, the policy is we don't stick to the wording because we must respect the genius of each language. And people don't talk words, they speak sentences or texts.
Yeah.
So what happens then, that your translators, they must interpret the meaning of the sentence of the text, and then they must translate it. That's why you'll find quite a big difference between, for example, the Good News Bible and the RSV in terms of the wording. The whole idea of this meaning-based translations is also to say, I must make certain what can the people I'm translating for, what can they understand? So I must try to make it understandable for them. I must translate the meaning of the text for them. I don't have to care so much about the form of the wording of the source text, as long as I can capture the meaning. Now, I can, I say this is just a little bit of oversimplification, because not all meaning-based translations are the same. But what happened with so the meaning, let me go take one step backwards. I think since the 1950s, especially due to the work of Eugene Nida, and we can talk later more about him, we had a whole flood of meaning-based translations, but they're not all the same. So you get translations that are more and more of a paraphrase. I think of The Message, for example, where the people try to translate the Bible as if it's happening today.
Okay.
While you can say your Good News Bible will still try to say, okay, I'll still stick to the culture here, but what with, for example, with The Message, it is as if everything is happening today.
Okay.
So you get more and more in that, let's say, in the direction of paraphrases and trying to more to account for the culture of the readers of today.
Do you have an example, Christo, of a paraphrased Bible that we have currently in the English Bibles for maybe for the benefit of our audience?
Yes, and I think I refer to The Message, and I also refer, the Living Bible is also an example of a paraphrase.
Okay.
But I just want to say that the Living Bible was not made from the Hebrew and the Greek, while The Message was made from the Greek and the Hebrew. So also the contemporary English version is also quite a paraphrase, but not as far as The Message. I think The Message is at this point in time the most, I won't say extreme, because I think the people that did it, they knew the Greek and the Hebrew.
Okay.
But they are, yeah, on the continuum of from word for word to, let's say, free translation, paraphrase. The Message is on the other side of the continuum.
To ensure that we keep bringing you tough conversations like these, please support our ministry by donating as little as 50 Rand per month. You can find our banking details on our website, hulusoministries.co.za.
Okay, great. And you mentioned something quite interesting, that some translations follow a word for word, and some are paraphrases, some are more sort of in the middle of the road. Do we find that with other translations, that when you're translating, say, from the Hebrew text, do we lose some of the meaning that it was embedded in the Hebrew text when you try and make this maybe contemporization of the text to as if you're reading it in today's sort of happening?
There's no doubt about that. That is unavoidable. And that is, I think, in a sense, the tension right through the centuries. How do I stay, so we can say, on the one hand, how do I stay true to the text,
Yeah.
to the, I mean, the people, in the Islam, people say you don't translate the Quran, you cannot do that. In a sense, they're correct. It's very difficult. So on the one hand, you have this idea, okay, how do I stay true? And I'm certain it's still the word of the Lord. And on the other hand, how can I make it understandable? If you go back in the history, it's very interesting. The first translation of the Bible was the Old Testament. And then the whole Bible was not there. It was about 200 before the Common Era. So I have to translate now the Greek people, the Jews in Alexandria. They couldn't understand the Hebrew anymore, so they need a Greek translation. And what we read in the tradition, the rabbis were very, very felt that was a very bad thing. They say this is impossible, but eventually the LXX was made. But
Can you help out? Sorry to interrupt you, Christo. Mention the term LXX. I think many of our listeners may not be quite familiar with the term. What it actually means.
Yes, thank you. The LXX means 70. Now it's supposed to be 72. How it represents apparently the rabbis that came over with the scrolls to Egypt. They were representative of the 12 tribes, 6 each. And so it must be 72, but how it became 70, we don't know. The LXX sticks somewhere in history. But what was interesting about the LXX? if one look at the entire old translation of the Greek, this old Greek translation, we find that some sections are absolutely word for word, especially the Pentateuch and the Psalms, but not the book of Proverbs. It's very free. The book of Jeremiah is a little bit shorter. So scholars that studied this first translation said, well, it's very clear that this could not be one team. But the story came that those 72 rabbis that were brought over to Alexandria, they put on an island there, they were put in different rooms, and they came out when they done it in a very short span of time, each his own translation, but all the translations agreed.
Okay.
So can you see the authority of that translation, in a sense, became established, in a sense, by a magical, something magic that happens.
Okay. I see.
And we know that that Bible was also the Old Testament. It was the Bible of the people of the New Testament, of the New Testament authors. But the same thing happened more or less with the Vulgate. I cannot say when I say the same thing, it means it got its authority from the outside.
Okay.
There it was the Pope that said to Jerome, make a translation. He didn't actually make a new translation. There were a lot of Latin translations about in the 400 of the Common Era, and he had to make it, revise it, because the Pope felt there were so many different translations and it was confusing to the people. But what we do know is that eventually that Bible took about 400 years to be fully accepted by the church. And it was only about 1300, 13th century, that the Vulgate was made the official Bible of the Roman Catholic Church. Okay. So can you see the authority came from outside?
Okay. So would you say that the text, the Bible, with these Bibles, coming up, there's always a resistance that I feel, before they get accepted, there's also that pushing and shoving for the Bible to be accepted by the public as well.
Yes, that was right through history. People never liked the new Bible. Now we can understand that. It's because people got used to a Bible. Now, I just want to say, interesting with the Reformation, when they now start translating, when now not the Vulgate or the Latin translation, those translations at first, the King James was also very word for word, because they had to stood on their own feet to show that they are close to the source text. Okay. And as far as you say that they were not, even there were some people that always resisted the King James. They say bad scholarship, bad English. And we know it eventually became the most prestigious translation of all times. Okay. Yeah. So I just want to say, and this whole idea of word for word, if one compare, for example, the King James of 1611 and its revision in 1880, it's interesting that the revision was more word for word than the 1611 King James.
So it even became more word for word. Yeah.
Even because people that became ingrained that every one word, one meaning, and the 1880, the revised King James was never so widely accepted as the original 1611. But I just want to say, this whole idea of word for word as one way to stay true to the text, that was generally accepted till about the 1950s. And this is where Eugene Nida came in with his so-called dynamic or functional equivalent model, where he said, well, we know now languages differ so much. If we stick word for word, people will misunderstand their Bibles. Okay, and so we know that is true.
And just to backtrack, Christo, sorry to interrupt there. You mentioned a dynamic equivalence sort of approach or method of Bible interpretation. And how would you say that compared to a word for word, a dynamic equivalence, it's more like in the middle of the road, or how would you sort of oversimplify that? I'm just trying for the benefit of the audience.
Yeah. Maybe let me I will try to say what was the basic idea of Eugene Nida.
Okay.
United said the genius of every language must be respected.
Okay.
He says what you can say in one language, you can also say in another language. So he regards translation as a switch of codes. So you have to have you study your Greek and your Hebrew, and you decode the message
Okay.
and then you encode it again in the target language that of the translation.
Whether
so
it's
the form is not so,
Whether
the form is not so, the formal aspect is not so important. It's the message that's important. That's why the notion meaning. Now, where does this dynamic equivalence come into? Naida says, when you translate, the effect of the translation of today must be the same as the effect when the first audience listened to the Greek and the Hebrew. So there is the whole idea of dynamic. Now, because dynamic, many people misunderstood this notion dynamic. Naida later called this functional equivalence.
Okay.
So, and it means then the message is the same.
Okay.
So if you ask me where on this continuum, I would say dynamic equivalents tend to be on the other side, over against word for word.
Okay.
Naida used the term formal equivalent and dynamic equivalent as the poles. He didn't use the word for word. So he just formal, it respect the form, and the other one respect the meaning. That's why it's functional. It has the same function, the same meaning.
Okay. All right. It makes sense. It makes sense. So do you have an example of a Bible like that is more of a dynamic equivalence or functional equivalence today?
Yes, the first big one was the Good News Bible. It was about 1968, if I remember correctly. It was first published, and it was a big hit. I think they said about 10 million or 8 to 10 million sold very quickly. Not everybody accepted this dynamic equivalent or functional equivalent. Other examples I can say is that the New Living Translation, the Contemporary English Version, also the Common English Bibles are all examples of the functional or the dynamic equivalent approach.
Okay. And will the NIV also be part of the group? The NIV?
No, that is an interesting question. The NIV was, in a sense, some people regard it as a reaction against the Good News Bible. Okay. Now, the people of the NIV, firstly, they didn't like the theology of the Good News Bible, and they were a conservative group of scholars, and they tried to follow more a middle-of-road approach. To say, to try to be as closely to the text as possible, but good idiomatic English. Okay. And they also involved a lot of scholars. That's why I call it the New International Version. But the irony, most of that international is actually Americans that worked on the NIV. Okay. But a feature of the NIV is that they had a standing committee that revised the NIV on a regular basis. Okay. So you'll find that's also important whenever you open an NIV, look at the date, which version are you working with? Okay. So they're not the same. They're not the same practically. Basically, you're saying they all differ based on when they were published. Yeah, they are. I mean, those were not dramatic changes, but there were some changes made. I think 1978, and especially I think you compare the 1978 version with the 2011 version, there are quite a number of changes. Okay. That is interesting, Christo. So what I'm picking up from you and and what you're saying basically is that these Bible translations over time, we see different approaches that are getting adopted by either Bible societies or even private initiatives that bring these Bibles to the public. And now, would you say then, because we often see other Bibles that have
notes in them, and people sort of view these Bibles as study Bibles. Would you be able to flesh out what are these Bibles? Are they study Bibles, or are they trying to achieve something into the market?
Yes, thank you. I think that, yeah, that is also important. I actually should have said that earlier. It's also important to distinguish between what is called a Bible and what is regarded today as a study Bible. I don't like the term study Bible, but that is reality. A study Bible typically is a Bible. It can be the NIV, you can have the ESV. So it means they use that text and they add just notes for a specific audience. So you can get a woman's study Bible, a study Bible for teenagers. But then they use a specific text. So it's that company or publishing house that added some notes to that Bible for a specific audience.
Okay.
But another important thing is, and I have to elaborate on this. One of the mistakes that Naida made, he was a genius. He also had very high respect for different cultures. But towards the end of around 2000, especially the United Bible Society, well, by the way, that Eugene Naida was working for the United Bible Society. And they started to realize everybody was following the functional equivalent approach.
Okay.
Well, the reason for this was that Eugene Naida, he said that his approach was a scientific approach. And he wrote a book, Kapot, Theory and Practice of Translation, with very closely a methodology of what you must do in a team to make your translation. Because translations now, especially people that don't know Greek or Hebrew, don't have a quite where you have a translation team that has to be taken from mother tongue speakers from a community, and many of them don't have any formal education. How do you help them to stay true to the text?
Okay.
To come up with a text that you can trust. And this is what Naida said with his handbook and his method. He was helping your translation teams to make a translation that people can trust, because they cannot just look whether it's word for word anymore. They must follow Kapot.
Okay.
One of the problems here is that, now I don't want to use too big words, Naida used the so-called code model of communication. That means words are containers. So the containers of every language, so you have containers with words are containers, and they have messages in them.
Okay.
But the containers are not all the same.
Okay.
In Lesotho, the containers may be square, and in English may be round.
Yes.
So you must just unpack the meaning from Greek and Hebrew and pack it in Sesotho.
Okay.
But what we know now in communication studies is language don't work like that.
Yes.
If you talk in Xhosa, for example, of my Ikaya, it's not only the place where you grew up.
Yes.
It's the whole history where people were born and your people lived.
Yes.
So how do you, we often use the word in South Africa about a braai.
Yeah.
A braai in Cape Town is different like a braai in Johannesburg.
Yes.
In Cape Town, the guys will have chops and broodjies, and in the north they will have little pap and wors, and they will have steak. So
yes.
Even in one culture, in the same time,
yes.
your words are so embedded in culture
yes.
that it's dangerous to think words are only containers.
Okay. Yeah.
Now, the need for study Bibles is because if you give a person, let's say, a Bible without any notes, it's so easy to misunderstand the text because you read it with your own frame of reference, with your own worldview.
Okay.
Now, that's why in recent times, people are very critical about so-called functional equivalent translations, because one of the assumptions is that you can make this old ancient text from a culture and a time that's completely different from today, you can make it understandable to people today without any notes. Because a Bible without the notes is also a historical thing. That was not always like that.
Okay.
So
what you say is that all Bibles prior to them not having notes had notes before? Is that what you're saying?
Well, it's interesting. If you look at the English translations, the Geneva Bible was full of notes. Even the first Dutch Bible was full of notes. But King James, of the 1611 translation, there was a church political decision not to add notes, because some of the notes in the Geneva Bible were criticizing the king, and sometimes they were afraid that people will make theological remarks in notes. So in the King James, there were notes, but only where there was a problem with the source text. And they say, oh, we don't fully understand the source text.
By the source text, you mean Hebrew or Greek or what?
The Greek and the Hebrew, yes.
Okay,
yes.
All right, fantastic.
So, yeah, and towards the end of the 19th century, there was a general tendency in translation is that when you translate, for example, Dostoevsky or Tolstoy from Russian, it must read as if it's English. So the whole idea, if you present somebody a Bible that was in his mother tongue, that is, you have presented as if this was written in his or her mother tongue.
Wow.
So this whole idea that Bible without notes is the normal thing, that's a modern phenomenon. In recent thinking in the world of Bible translation, at least where I come from, is that it's impossible to make a translation without notes.
Okay.
Where you help your readers, where you can have a misunderstanding.
Okay.
We typically, for example, if you say in Genesis 20, for example, Abram was a foreigner.
Yes.
Now in South Africa, some people will say, hey, where is this person? What is they will think this must be somebody outside the country.
Yes.
And this person is just coming here maybe to threaten my job. So there's a lot of history about a foreigner or an alien. While in the time of the Bible, you had, when you was a foreigner, the king was responsible for you. There was hospitality rules. And the king have to look after you. He has to negotiate. You negotiate with not the king or the chief. You negotiate water rights where you can graze your and water your animals. But apart from that, you did not have any rights.
Okay.
You were not allowed to be in court, etc. Now, this is an example that if you have now this word foreigner, alien, people today, they will put in wrong things there.
Okay.
So that's why in Bible translation today, we'll say often you have to explain to your readers either in a footnote or a long word list at the back of the Bible. I think the New Afrikaans Bible, we have about 70 pages of notes. In English, the Net Bible, for example, the Net Bible has about 60,000 notes.
Wow.
Explaining to people, the readers, where a translation comes from, or sometimes to better understand something cultural that you cannot understand otherwise.
So what I'm picking up from what you're saying, Christo, is that a lot of the Bibles that we have, or even language itself, it's difficult for us to understand some of the languages, the words that are used in the Bible itself in modern day thinking, because we kind of sort of do more of an anachronistic reading. So we read modern day sort of word meaning into the text, but it may not actually be how those words were actually understood in that particular culture of the Bible.
Absolutely. I think that is the big change that we have today, is that people have to realize the otherness of the culture of the Bible. Otherness because the otherness from ourselves, so that we don't read all what we have and our frame of reference, our worldview into the Bible.
But is that something in your experience? Do you think it is something that one can do, or it's something that is all one has to sort of manage? Because we often come with baggage when we read the biblical text, and it's it's a lot difficult to actually sort of neutralize yourself and say, I'm just going to look at the text. And it's kind of difficult to do that. But what I hear you saying is that these words that we find in the biblical text carry their own sort of cultural connotations to them. And one has to be careful of that when reading these texts.
I think that is the job of pastors to, because sometimes they're the culprits.
Yes.
Now, of course, I'm talking now as a teacher of Hebrew, so I always tell my students my main mission is to let them never trust any translation of the Bible. I cannot teach them in 2 years or 3 years to be fluent in Hebrew, but I can make them distrust any translation. I'm not saying all translations are bad. I just want to say you must be careful and you must make certain what you get when you use this particular Bible translation. A good place is to start looking what the Bible says about itself. That will give you an idea. What do they say? What is the function of that Bible?
Okay, so what you're saying is that not all Bibles have the same objective into the market.
Yes.
So one has to sort of, where can they get that kind of information to say what is this Bible's objective? Can you sort of tell our audience?
Yes, well, as I've said, the first thing is read the front matter, the foreword of it. Now, nowadays, I tell the students, Google that Bible. Look where it comes from. Look what the Bible says about itself. Try to find reviews of that Bible. But a very important thing is we have to also realize that different Bibles have different purposes.
Okay.
So some Bible can be for a first generation of Christians that want to understand. So they want it easy. And maybe a functional equivalent is better for them.
Okay.
While for a Bible study group, you would like more a formal equivalent, or the New Afrikaans Bible, which we call a direct. We don't have time to go into that, into a direct translation, or a Bible with a lot of notes that help people to understand. So it's more of an effort to read that Bible because you must read all those notes. You must go look in the back, or let's say any word list that it has. Sometimes people say people don't read footnotes, but you have to discipline yourself. Okay. So in a sense, it depends also on the need of the reader. And that's what I say. There's a lot. I wish that we can teach pastors better to help the congregation to say, listen, be careful for this one. For example, I would say the New King James Bible, I would be very careful about that one because it's a very commercial project that they use they didn't use very good source text. They used the source text of 1611. And it's very word for word, just changing the word. So people have to give pastors have to give the members of the congregation some background and help them. It's impossible for you to give you all the little rules to choose between a Bible translation.
Okay.
But I just want to say, be careful.
Okay. And would you say in your experience and in your work that you have done previously that you find that some Bibles are more reliable than the other ones? And if there is such a thing, why is that? If you could sort of explain as maybe as our last question that we'll get into.
Yeah. Again, one must be careful now to generalize. What I did find is that some commercial translations, that's if a Bible house produce a lot of Bibles and you can see on a regular interval, my experience is that you don't have that quality control and consistency. Because if you have one word, can have so many meanings, but you must make certain in every context that particular meaning is translated correctly. So that quality control you often don't find with commercial translations. Typically your Bible Society translations, because they have all those built-in mechanisms. I'm not saying that all Bible Society translations are good and all commercial translations are bad. I just say the chances are better for a Bible Society translation to have some quality control because it goes through different processes.
Okay. Okay, great. I think in a nutshell, you've sort of given us a perspective on how complex these Bible translations are and the approaches that they sort of employ in translating these Bibles. And one can often find himself or herself in a sort of a murky area without knowing exactly which one to sort of go for. But I think what you have sort of highlighted in this conversation is that they all bring something to the table. So we cannot all weigh them, you know, according to the same sort of standard as I've sort of heard you say.
Yes. I think the important thing is to ask questions, be careful, don't accept everything that you see, don't just grasp the Bible and think that's the one for me. Find out, try to find information about that Bible. That or maybe you'll find that helpful.
Okay, great. I don't know if there are questions from some of our panel here that they want to ask, but if there is no question from the panel, then we're gonna end it here. You know, I think what you have highlighted today sort of makes one to think and of course makes one to sort of be tentative in their approach to you know just taking what the Bible interpretation says at face value. One has to sort of be cautious at the same time ask questions. I think we have one question from Tabang, and yeah, Tabang.
Guys, thanks for the presentation. Very informative. I have one question. Maybe the context of the question in South Africa, as it is now. For many years, we've been taught a lot of things, and those things are brought to us in a sense that they are doctrines, and as such, it's a problem to question them. It becomes a taboo when you make an attempt to question such things. So what's the best manner in addressing such matters in our South African churches without appearing as if you are antichrist? Because people go as far as taking you an antichrist or fallen or a heretic. So how can we best, what method is there to address such issues? Because it's important. People are held captive to teachings that are very apprehensive and they are stopping them from living out their lives. Thank you.
Okay, I'm not too sure if I got what Tabang is asking, but what I'm sort of deducing from the question is that are there some teaching sort of mechanism that one can sort of try and lean towards in terms of what the Bible teaches? I mean, I know that that's a very complex question that you're asking, and I'm not too sure if, Christo, what is your take on it?
Yes, no, I just want to say, I mean, that question came from the side of Bible translation. That is very difficult
Yes.
to answer. I just want to say what I what I observed just from the outside. If a study was made on the translation of the word evet, so in a certain time it was translated as a slave, and later on it was translated as servant.
Okay.
So you also have that Bible translation often mirrors some of the thinking. Well, that's more political. Now the question was more theological, and I cannot comment on that.
Yes, because that's more of a theological reading. That's what you're saying. That I know.
Yes, I would be careful. I would rather not. I know how difficult Bible translation and interpretation is.
Oh, yeah.
So I would be hesitant to quickly say this is the recipe.
Yes.
I just can say it is a very difficult one, and one has sometimes to do that on your knees and thinking and understanding and do it in a safe environment. But I understand. I feel for the challenge, but I unfortunately I would not regard me as a theologian. I rather regard me as a person that knows some of the problems of Bible translation.
Yes, yes. No, thank you for that, Christo. And I think I have two last questions for you. One of our audience is writing here saying, we have some Bibles that when you look at them, you have they're missing some verses in different versions, and why?
Yes.
How would you? Why is that? Why
Yes.
causes that?
Yes. Yes. Now that's a very good question. It is because some of the, let's start with the King James. The King James used the Hebrew and Greek text that they had at that point in time, and that was not the oldest text that they used. So later on, when we discovered older text of the Greek and the Hebrew, it was found that some sections were not included there in this earlier text, and that's why some sections are then, let's say, for example, in the New RSV, you'll find some sections that's not in the New RSV, but that you'll find in the King James, because the King James used I can say a less reliable text, because it was an older text, while the New RSV would use it was a younger text.
Okay.
While the New RSV used an older text, which we think is more trustworthy than, for example, the one the King James used, the so-called Textus Receptus that was used by the King James.
Okay, and thank you for that answer, Christo. And then one of our audience is asking here, what are some of the cautions or ways one has to sort of teaching Bible as a lay person when you don't have a good background in Greek and Hebrew?
Yes, I think. Thank you for that question. My whole observation about be careful to too quick to interpret the text for now. As a lay person, well, if I got my wife likes her NIV study Bible. So, of course, and I'm not saying the NIV is the best study Bible. I just want to say that is a very good, this is one of the good study Bibles. And for a lay person at this point in time, I would suggest that you try to get hold of a good study Bible, because then you have some background, and it will often help you not to make too quick decisions in terms of your own modern understanding of the world.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much, Christo. I think there's so much that you have touched on, and there's so much that needs one to sort of sit back and really think about and be cautious, as the word that I'll take from this conversation that we've had. And just as a final word from yourself, I know you're working hard in the background, and can you sort of help and tell some of our audience what you're currently working on in the background and what you've worked on, and where can they get some of the stuff that you've actually published before?
Well, at the moment, I'm into body parts like you, because one of the biggest challenges of the New Afrikaans Bible is the word nephesh, which means typically translated as soul, and also heart. And sometimes if you to speak in your heart, is it the same as, what does it mean? So in terms of trying to see how should you understand how body parts was conceptualized in the ancient world, and if you translate it, that you don't translate it wrongly. For example, just translate wherever you have this word nephesh, translated as soul, like the King James, because then it can give rise to misunderstanding. Most of my work and what we have done in the New Afrikaans Bible, you can find on the website of the Bible Society of South Africa. I'm not working for the Bible Society of South Africa, but I was part of my church, the Dutch Reformed Church, nominate me to work on the new Bible in Afrikaans, and I try to write up the history of this translation. And so all the research and findings you will find at the website of the Bible Society of South Africa, especially the whole idea, a Bible with notes that you use, the use and the challenge of what you should include and what you shall not include in such a Bible.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Christo, for your time, and thank you very much for all our audience for taking up their time to also listen up to this conversation that we've had on this fascination on Bible translations, particularly in our context where we find ourselves with this multiplicity of these English translations let alone the Bantu translations that are around in circulation in South Africa. Thank you very much. That's all we have time for today, and I appreciate you coming through. Much appreciated. Until next time, we'll meet again. Thank you.
Okay, it's a pleasure, and good luck with your ministry.
Thank you. Thank you.
Puluso Ministries is a non-profit educational enterprise founded in 2019. The ministry is informed by academic scholarship. At Puluso, we embrace multiple perspectives in our engagement with Scripture. We seek to provide non-Christians and Christians from all backgrounds and denominations with resources that provide an honest intellectual engagement with the Bible. We embrace multiple perspectives in fostering a more open, moderate society into the 21st century and beyond.
To ensure that we keep bringing you tough conversations like these, please support our ministry by donating as little as 50 Rand per month. You can find our banking details on our website, pulusoministries.co.za.